Detective Cole Mercer was the kind of man who made entrances the way thunder follows lightning, loud, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. His boots clicked down precinct hallways like a warning shot, his voice a deep rumble that silenced junior officers before they even dared to speak. He'd earned his reputation early, closing impossible cases, outsmarting gang leaders, and bending suspects until they broke. The department lauded him as a natural, a man whose instincts were sharper than any textbook training. But what no one saw, or rather what no one dared to name aloud, was that his brilliance had fermented into arrogance. Cole had long since stopped chasing justice. What he sought instead was control. The feeling of commanding the narrative in every interrogation room, every press conference, every courtroom appearance. To him, justice was a performance, and he was both director and star. His words could tilt juries, his charisma could disarm witnesses, and his uniform, pristine, pressed, gleaming with metals, was his costume of authority. His colleagues joked that he owned the courtroom. The prosecutors trusted his reports without question, the judges gave weight to his testimony as though it came from divine law itself. Even defense attorneys, notorious for their cynicism, knew better than to challenge his findings head-on. Cole had become a myth in human form, a figure so insulated by his victories that doubt no longer penetrated his world. Yet beneath the swagger and smirk lay something darker. Entitlement. It began subtly, a skipped protocol here, a conveniently lost piece of evidence there. He told himself these shortcuts served justice. After all, who cared about paperwork when the bad guys were behind bars? Over time, each ethical compromise blurred into the next, until the very concept of truth became pliable in his hands. Every arrest was a show. He'd flash that signature half-smile for cameras, his eyes glinting with satisfaction as the flashbulbs immortalized his heroic work. He relished the sound of reporters saying his name, the way his photo appeared above fold lines in morning papers. The department's internal affairs team once reviewed one of his cases after a complaint, but Cole walked in with a confidence so absolute that the investigators themselves felt small. He left that meeting untouched, reputation intact, and pride even stronger. His success had become his shield and his poison. He couldn't see that his influence, so carefully constructed, was rotting from within. Each unchallenged lie reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. Cole began choosing cases not based on justice, but on visibility. Anything that could put his face on television, anything that would feed his legend. And when rumors started circulating about a private investigator digging into local corruption, Cole didn't hesitate. He saw it as another opportunity, a chance to clean up the city and cement his authority. He didn't know that this case would be his undoing, that the person he targeted would shatter every illusion he had ever built about his power, his badge, and himself. In the quiet hours of the night, when the applause faded and the city lights dimmed, Cole rarely reflected. He told himself that reflection was for the weak, but there was always a flicker, a half-formed thought he'd crush before it took shape. It whispered that one day the same system he manipulated might turn on him, that one day the applause would stop. He never listened. For Cole Mercer, humility was an emotion reserved for others. His world was a chessboard, and he was convinced he was always the one moving the pieces. But soon he'd realize that while he'd been playing a game of strategy, someone else had been quietly rewriting the rules. The call came in on a gray morning thick with fog, a supposed assault victim found in an upscale apartment complex downtown. To most detectives it looked routine, an open and shut case with a few inconsistencies that could be ironed out later. But to Cole Mercer, it was the perfect canvas for another career-defining victory. The victim, a quiet man living alone, had been discovered unconscious, and the scene suggested an attempted robbery. There were marks of forced entry, shattered glass, and a trail of scattered papers. Cole's eyes gleamed the moment he stepped inside. The air smelled of opportunity. He took command immediately, barking orders, snapping photos, and constructing the narrative before the forensics team even began. He wasn't looking for truth. He was searching for confirmation. Confirmation that fit the version of events already forming in his mind. The suspect was identified within hours. A young maintenance worker with a minor record. Someone who'd had access to the building. It was almost too convenient. Cole ignored the inconsistencies, the lack of fingerprints, the mismatched blood types, the absence of stolen items. He told his team it didn't matter. He did it, he said flatly, and that was the end of discussion. In his report he wrote with precision and flair, crafting a story that would read well in court and sound airtight under oath. Witness statements were edited for clarity. Timelines were adjusted to simplify the sequence of events. Every detail was sculpted to reinforce the conclusion he'd already decided on. When his partner, Detective Harris, hesitated, mentioning that the evidence felt too neat, too clean, Cole waved him off with a smirk. "We're not priests, Harris. We're problem solvers. The system doesn't need saints, it needs results." And results were what he delivered. Within 48 hours, the suspect confessed under pressure. But what Cole didn't include in his report was the way that confession had been coaxed out, through hours of psychological warfare, deprivation, and threats that blurred the boundary of legality. Cole called it technique. Others might have called it coercion. Still, the department cheered his efficiency. Another criminal caught, another headline victory, but cracks were beginning to form. A clerk noticed that a piece of evidence logged on the first day, the victim's sealed envelope, had vanished. A forensics officer noted inconsistencies between Cole's statements and the recovered data, and when the medical report came back, it revealed something unsettling. The victim's injuries didn't align with Cole's timeline. Cole brushed it off. "Paperwork errors," he said. "Medical people love to complicate things." His confidence was armor, and his words had weight. Those who doubted him stayed silent, afraid of crossing a man whose influence could decide careers. But the case began to unravel in quiet corners. Whispers in hallways, small discrepancies in documents, and the nagging question no one dared to ask: who, exactly, was the victim? Cole's fabricated story, once solid as stone, began showing hairline fractures. Reporters probing deeper noticed that the victim's identity had been kept confidential by order of higher authorities. The files were sealed unusually fast, and federal agents appeared at the precinct with an interest that felt disproportionate for a simple assault case. Cole didn't care. He believed he could talk his way out of anything, he always had. His mind was already focused on the courtroom drama to come, the sharp suits, the flashing cameras, the awe of the jury as he told his version of the truth. He didn't know that every sentence he wrote, every report he falsified, was setting the stage not for another victory, but for his public undoing. Because behind those sealed files and mysterious interventions was a truth powerful enough to strip him of the illusion he'd spent a lifetime building. And for the first time his lies had found an audience that wouldn't believe him, not because they didn't trust his badge, but because the person he had victimized outranked every badge in the room. The first time Detective Cole Mercer saw the man lying unconscious in that sterile white hospital room, he didn't see a person. He saw a puzzle that needed solving, a case to conquer, another headline waiting to bear his name. The victim was middle-aged, impeccably dressed even in disarray, with faint bruises tracing his temple and wrist. The attending nurse mentioned he'd been attacked in his own apartment, sustaining blunt trauma to the head and severe internal bruising. To Mercer it seemed open and shut, a clean narrative. A man attacked, a suspect in custody, and a detective ready to take credit for swift justice. But there was something about the victim that tugged at the edges of Mercer's instincts, the flicker of unease he quickly suppressed. The man's watch was custom-made, his pen engraved with initials too elegant to belong to the average citizen. His apartment, still sealed off by police tape, had walls lined with leather-bound books on constitutional law, and his email logs contained communications with names Mercer recognized from federal briefings, but Mercer brushed it all aside. "Everyone knows someone," he muttered. "Doesn't mean a thing." When the victim finally regained consciousness 2 days later, Mercer was there, notebook in hand, voice smooth and confident. He introduced himself with the charm that had won over countless witnesses before. "You're safe now," he said. "I'm Detective Mercer. We'll take care of everything." The man's eyes, still groggy from medication, flickered with something Mercer couldn't name. Fear, or perhaps recognition. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then hesitated. "What's your name, sir?" Mercer asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't matter much to him. The man's response was faint, measured, and oddly deliberate. "You can call me Mr. Reed." That name didn't appear in the system. No identification matched it. Yet Mercer didn't press. Maybe the man was frightened, confused, or wanted privacy. It didn't matter. The suspect had confessed, the paperwork was signed, and the case was practically wrapped. Another win for Detective Mercer. But small inconsistencies began to surface, like cracks beneath polished marble. The hospital's administrative staff treated the patient with a deference unusual for a supposed civilian. Agents in dark suits began visiting the hospital late at night, flashing credentials too fast to read, leaving cryptic notes in the file room. The precinct received a quiet phone call requesting that all documentation regarding the Reed case be sealed, pending review by federal authorities. Cole scoffed when his captain mentioned it. "Federal review? It's a basic assault case," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Unless this guy's got friends in high places." His captain gave him a look that made even Cole pause. "Maybe he is the friend in high places." Cole laughed it off, but the idea stuck to his thoughts like static. He returned to the victim's apartment, retracing the steps of that chaotic night. The entry wounds didn't match a standard break-in. The angle of the assault suggested familiarity, a close-quarters confrontation, not random violence. Something in the files didn't align. The victim had no criminal record, no debts, no enemies on paper. His life, as documented, was spotless. Too spotless. Then, there were the documents Mercer had skimmed and dismissed. Letters stamped with government seals, a private security clearance notice, and a sealed envelope addressed to a name that now lingered at the edge of his memory. He couldn't quite recall where he'd heard it before, but it gnawed at him, deep and persistent. Days passed. Mr. Reed refused further interviews, citing medical fatigue. He declined all visitors except for one. A woman who arrived in a black sedan with tinted windows, stayed precisely 15 minutes and left without a word. The hospital staff whispered that she wasn't family. Cole's instincts began to war with his ego. He wanted to believe the story he'd already written, the one where he was the hero, solving a simple case. But his gut whispered otherwise. Something monumental lay beneath this facade, something that could either elevate him to legend or destroy everything he'd built. The truth revealed itself not through discovery, but through confrontation. A week later, when Cole was summoned to a briefing by Internal Affairs, he expected routine questioning. Instead, he walked into a room thick with tension, 3 federal agents waiting at the table. They introduced themselves politely, their tone smooth but edged with authority. One of them slid a folder across the table, stamped in bold, "Confidential Federal Judicial Branch." The photo inside made Cole's stomach drop. It was Mr. Reed, dressed in judicial robes, standing behind a bench, gavel in hand. Under the photograph, the name read, "Honorable Judge Jonathan Keaton, United States District Court." Cole blinked, the weight of it slamming into him. The victim he had built his case around, the man he'd casually labeled Mr. Reed, the one he'd brushed off as inconsequential, was a sitting federal judge conducting covert oversight into police misconduct. Every fabricated word in his report, every manipulated timestamp, every coerced confession suddenly transformed from clever tactics into evidence of perjury, obstruction, and federal violation. And still Cole's pride refused to yield. He closed the folder, forced a grin, and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, masking the panic beneath his arrogance, "nobody told me he was royalty." Before he was known as the victim, Judge Jonathan Keaton was one of the most respected figures in the federal judiciary, measured, eloquent, and fiercely protective of the integrity of the law. But beneath his calm demeanor lay an obsession that few understood, rooting out corruption within law enforcement. His decades on the bench had exposed him to too many tainted cases, too many detectives who twisted truth for convenience or glory. He had watched justice bend until it nearly broke, and so quietly he began his own investigation. Keaton lived a life divided between 2 worlds. By day, he presided over cases with stoic precision, his name carrying enough gravity to make even the most hardened attorneys tread carefully. By night, he sifted through documents, tips, and testimonies that painted a grim picture of the very institutions meant to uphold justice. He'd seen patterns, cases that closed too neatly, evidence that conveniently disappeared, suspects coerced into confessions, and one name appeared too often: Detective Cole Mercer. For months, Keaton worked discreetly, using an alias, Charles Reed, to operate beyond the visibility of his position. He compiled data, sought witnesses, and traced financial irregularities linking certain precinct officials to unauthorized payments. He never intended to confront Mercer directly, but his inquiry brought him too close to the detective's most recent operation. The night of the assault wasn't random. It was retaliation. Keaton had scheduled a meeting that evening with a confidential informant connected to Mercer's department. But someone leaked his location. What happened next was a blur of violence. A shadowy figure ambushed him, leaving him bleeding on the marble floor of his apartment. Whether it was a hired hand or a desperate warning, he couldn't be sure. When the police arrived, led by Mercer himself, Keaton recognized the name instantly. The irony was chilling. The man whose conduct he had been investigating now stood over him, badge gleaming, dictating the official record of his victimhood. Even through the haze of pain, Keaton understood what was happening. He couldn't reveal his identity, not yet. If Mercer knew who he was, the cover operation he'd built over months would implode. So he lied, adopting the name Mr. Reed, watching silently as Mercer twisted facts to fit his narrative. Every falsified note, every contradiction became ammunition Keaton quietly documented from his hospital bed. He knew the system well enough to let arrogance do the work. He observed how Mercer manipulated the press, how he sidestepped chain of command, how he molded evidence to maintain his legend. Keaton said little, listened much, and waited for the right moment to expose the deception. His recovery was slow, but his resolve sharpened with every passing day. When federal agents arrived to brief him, he gave them everything: files, recordings, and first-hand accounts that outlined a pattern of misconduct reaching far beyond Mercer alone. The agents urged him to remain silent until they could build an airtight case. And so, the judge-turned-victim remained in disguise, biding his time while Mercer strutted through the precinct as if already immortalized in history. What Mercer didn't realize was that his greatest performance was being recorded not by cameras or reporters, but by the very man whose downfall he had orchestrated. Behind closed doors, Keaton prepared to dismantle the myth of the invincible detective, not through vengeance, but through truth. The badge that once symbolized protection had been corrupted, and he intended to remind everyone, especially Cole Mercer, that the law's reach is long, its patience infinite, and its memory unforgiving. The day Detective Cole Mercer walked into the courtroom, he wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. The marble floors echoed under his polished boots, every step deliberate, every glance calculated. He believed this was his stage, his element, where words bent to his will and juries leaned toward his charm. The air itself seemed to shift as he entered, the murmur of voices dropping to a respectful hush. To everyone watching, he wasn't just a detective. He was the embodiment of authority, the man who brought order to chaos. Cole adjusted his tie, catching his reflection in the glossy wood panels of the courtroom door. He smirked at himself, the same smirk that had charmed reporters and disarmed defense attorneys for years. The case had garnered attention from both local and federal media, and he relished every second of it. The cameras, the reporters, the murmurs of "Detective Mercer's here," they were fuel to his ego. This wasn't just another trial, it was his coronation. When he took the witness stand, he exuded confidence. His voice carried effortlessly, steady, resonant, rehearsed yet natural. He began with the precision of a man who had told this story 100 times before, because he had. To him, every trial was theater, and he was its leading man. "Detective Mercer," the prosecutor began, her tone deferential, "please describe the events leading up to the suspect's arrest." Cole leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the jury. "Of course," he said, his tone smooth as glass. "It was an intense case, time-sensitive. I had to act fast. We received credible intel about the suspect's movements, and I made the call that led to the arrest. My priority was the safety of the public." He spoke in controlled rhythm, measured pauses, strategic inflections. Every word was carefully designed to evoke trust. The jurors nodded, some even smiled faintly. He could feel them aligning with him, their perception molded by his composure. The prosecutor smiled. She knew she had a star witness. But beneath that confident exterior was a man performing a balancing act over a pit of truth he hoped no one would see. The reports he'd filed had holes, the evidence chain had weak links, and the suspect's confession was obtained under questionable methods. Yet none of that mattered, he thought. Presentation was power, and Cole Mercer knew how to present. When the defense attorney rose, the atmosphere shifted. The man was older, deliberate in his movements, his gaze sharp but unflinching. He didn't look intimidated by Mercer's swagger. "Detective," he said, his voice even. "You stated that the suspect confessed voluntarily, correct?" Cole nodded. "That's right. And this confession occurred after 10 hours of interrogation?" "Roughly," Cole said dismissively. The attorney arched an eyebrow. "During which the suspect requested counsel multiple times?" Cole's smile didn't falter. "The suspect was evasive. We followed protocol." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney took a step closer to the jury box. "Detective Mercer," he said, "would you agree that following protocol is essential in ensuring justice?" "Of course." "So why," the attorney asked, sliding a document across the table, "does your report omit 3 separate requests for legal counsel documented in the interrogation room's audio log?" The air went still. Cole's smile thinned. He glanced briefly at the judge's bench, then back to the jury. "That must be a clerical error," he said, his tone calm but tighter now. "Paperwork isn't always perfect." The attorney let the silence hang. "You mean to say that the omission of 3 legal requests, each of which would render the confession inadmissible, was simply an oversight?" Cole leaned back, forcing a chuckle. "You can twist it however you like, counselor. I did my job." The attorney's eyes didn't leave his. "And yet," he said, "your job seems to involve rewriting events when they don't suit your story." Cole felt a flicker of irritation. The jury shifted uneasily, sensing the change in energy. He raised his chin slightly, a defiant glint in his eyes. "If doing my job means making tough calls under pressure, then yes, I'll take that responsibility." He thought the jury would admire his conviction. He thought the judge would see him as bold, decisive. He didn't notice the slight tightening of the judge's jaw, or the way the prosecutor's pen froze mid-scribble. He was too busy performing. When asked about the victim, he recited his version with clinical confidence. "The victim was cooperative once conscious. We obtained necessary statements, and his identification was verified through preliminary records." "Preliminary records?" the defense pressed. "You mean records that have since been sealed by federal order?" Cole blinked, momentarily thrown. "That's standard in certain cases," he said quickly. "Nothing unusual." The attorney smiled faintly. "Detective, are you aware of who the victim actually is?" Cole's mouth opened, then closed. "A civilian," he said, his tone clipped. The attorney glanced toward the bench, then returned his gaze to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will revisit that statement shortly." Cole didn't flinch outwardly, but inside his pulse had begun to race. Something about the attorney's tone unsettled him. He could feel the room's focus shifting, not toward his charm or authority, but toward the possibility that the story he'd built was beginning to crumble. Still, he held his composure, convincing himself he could talk his way through anything. He always had. The courtroom was his battlefield and his voice his weapon. What he didn't realize was that the next blow wouldn't come from the defense at all. It would come from the prosecution itself. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the air thick with anticipation as the prosecutor rose again. The room seemed smaller somehow, the light colder. Cole Mercer leaned back in the witness chair, arms folded loosely, masking his growing discomfort behind a veneer of confidence. The prosecutor approached slowly, a manila folder in hand. "Detective Mercer," she began. You've given this court your sworn statement regarding the victim, correct? I have. Yes, he said evenly. Every detail is accurate. The prosecutor stopped at the center of the courtroom, glancing briefly at the defense before turning toward the bench. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm, with the court's permission, the state would like to submit new evidence obtained from federal records. Cole frowned. Federal records? That wasn't part of the plan. The judge nodded curtly, and the prosecutor opened the folder, sliding a document onto the evidence screen. The projector flickered, displaying an official portrait that drew a collective gasp from the gallery. It was him. The victim. Only this time, the caption beneath the photograph didn't read Charles Reed. It read, Honorable Judge Jonathan Keaton, United States District Court. Cole felt the air punch out of his lungs. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The jurors looked from the screen to Mercer, disbelief etched across their faces. Even the reporters stopped typing. The prosecutor's voice cut through the stillness. Detective Mercer, you testified under oath that you were unaware of the victim's true identity. Is that correct? He swallowed. That's correct, he said, his voice quieter now. Then how do you explain this? She held up another sheet, a log of digital evidence showing that Mercer had accessed Keaton's sealed case file 3 days before the incident. Cole's composure shattered. That's not accurate, he stammered. I never... Those systems are restricted. I don't even have clearance. The prosecutor's tone remained steady. Your credentials were used, Detective. We have the metadata, timestamps, and security logs. The judge's gaze bore into him, cold and unyielding. Detective Mercer, he said, his voice low but resonant, are you telling this court that someone else used your access to review a federal judge's confidential records? Cole hesitated. Every eye in the room was on him. His mind scrambled for footing, for any version of the story that could save him. There must be a mistake, he said weakly. I was investigating leads. Maybe the system auto-synced. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. The sound of the gavel striking the bench was like a thunderclap. Detective, the judge said, you will refrain from speculation, facts only. For the first time in his career, Cole Mercer had no words. The silence that followed was deafening. The prosecutor continued, her tone colder now. Your report also claims that the victim's statements were taken voluntarily, yet, according to hospital records, Judge Keaton was unconscious at the time you filed that report. Would you like to explain how an unconscious man could give you a statement? Cole's face went pale. That's... he started, then stopped. His throat felt dry, his tongue heavy. It was a miscommunication, he said finally, grasping at the only excuse left. I must have meant post-recovery. The prosecutor's lips curved slightly, not in a smile, but in quiet disbelief. Then you won't mind explaining why your timestamp shows the report filed 9 hours before the victim regained consciousness. Conscious? A murmur rippled through the courtroom again. The jury leaned forward, their faith in him crumbling. Cole's carefully crafted image, the confident hero, the champion of justice, was unraveling thread by thread. The judge's gaze didn't waver. Detective Mercer, he said slowly, perjury is not a clerical error. Neither is obstruction. Cole's fingers tightened on the edge of the stand, his pulse pounded in his ears. The cameras that once adored him now seemed to glare with accusation. He wanted to shout, to argue, to remind them who he was, but the words wouldn't come. His silence said everything. The gavel struck again, echoing through the courtroom like a verdict before the verdict. The sound was final, resonant, absolute. And in that instant, the man who thought he owned the courtroom realized that the floor beneath him had vanished. For a long, breathless moment, the courtroom stood still. An unnatural, heavy stillness that seemed to press against the walls. The air carried the electric charge of disbelief, every sound swallowed by the weight of what had just been revealed. Reporters froze mid-sentence, their fingers hovering above keyboards. The jurors stared wide-eyed. their expressions caught between confusion and awe. Even the judge's gavel, now motionless on the bench, seemed reluctant to disturb the fragile quiet that had descended. Detective Cole Mercer sat rigid in the witness chair, his once proud posture collapsing under the invisible gravity of realization. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came. The confident smirk that had so often punctuated his arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, bewildered stare. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, the silent judgment of every person in the room piercing deeper than any cross-examination could. For the first time, Cole wasn't the commanding voice echoing through the courtroom. He was the subject of the silence, the cautionary tale unfolding in real time. Across the aisle, the prosecutor stood quietly, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to speak, the revelation spoke for itself. The defense attorney slowly closed his folder, his gaze resting on Mercer with something like pity. The judge leaned back, his eyes sharp and distant, studying the man before him as if reassessing every word, every testimony, every boast ever uttered. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. It was the sound of authority collapsing, of illusion meeting truth. Then came the shift, the quiet murmur that rolled through the courtroom like a storm awakening. Words buzzed at the edges of the room. Federal judge. Tampered evidence. Perjury. The realization moved like wildfire. Cole could feel it burning through the crowd, unraveling the myth he had built brick by brick. Every officer who had once admired him, every reporter who had once praised him, now looked upon him as something else entirely, a man caught in his own deception. The prosecutor's voice, calm but edged with steel, broke the murmuring. Your Honor, given the gravity of these findings, the state requests immediate suspension of the witness's credibility and referral for federal review. The judge nodded slowly, his gavel descending with a measured strike. Request granted. The words hit Cole harder than any blow. His badge, the symbol of power he had flaunted, suddenly felt heavier in his pocket, like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to him. He looked around and saw what consequence truly meant, not in punishment, but in exposure. His lies, his pride, his manipulation had all been dragged into the light, and there was nowhere left to hide. The crowd's whispers grew louder, their eyes no longer filled with awe, but with disbelief and quiet satisfaction. The courtroom that had once been his kingdom had transformed into his reckoning ground, and as the gavel's echo faded, Cole understood that authority, once abused, does not fade quietly. It falls with the full weight of consequence. The moment the proceedings ended, Cole Mercer's world began to unravel. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from reporters, messages from colleagues too afraid to speak to him directly. The department that once hailed him as its golden detective now moved to distance itself entirely. His commendations were suspended, his cases reopened, his record dissected line by line. The faces that once smiled at him in hallways now turned away. Each newspaper headline carried his downfall. Each televised report replayed his humiliation. The man who once controlled narratives now had no voice left in his own story. His career, once built on confidence and spectacle, collapsed into a public cautionary tale. News of the scandal spread faster than anyone could contain it. Social media erupted with disbelief and anger, citizens demanding accountability for years of deception hidden under authority's shadow. Editorials condemned him, protests sparked outside the courthouse, and his image, once a symbol of justice, became an emblem of betrayal. Talk shows dissected his arrogance. Commentators debated how deep the corruption ran. The city that had once celebrated him now spat his name with venom. No one expected Judge Jonathan Keaton to return. The reports had painted him as fragile, recovering quietly from his injuries, removed from the chaos of the courtroom that had nearly destroyed him. But the judge was not a man who believed in retreat. He had watched the spectacle unfold from his hospital room, the televised snippets showing Cole Mercer's performance on the stand. He had seen the arrogance, the deception, the subtle half-truths dressed as testimony, and beneath the bandages and exhaustion, something within him hardened into resolve. When word spread that he would be presiding over a post-hearing review concerning misconduct allegations, the entire courthouse erupted with disbelief. It wasn't just the gravity of the situation, it was the poetry of it. The victim would now sit in judgment over his own deceiver. The notion alone carried an electric charge through every corridor of the justice system. The day Judge Keaton returned to the bench, the courtroom was standing room only. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras waiting for a single image that would define the story's turning point. The hum of whispered speculation filled the room. When the doors opened and Keaton entered, dressed in the familiar black robes, his posture firm, though slightly weakened from recovery, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to pause in reverence. Cole Mercer was escorted in through a side entrance, no longer the star witness or the department's pride, but a man under investigation. His suit was immaculate, but his confidence had withered into something brittle. He avoided the eyes of those who had once admired him. His attorney whispered hurriedly, but Cole barely listened. He was too busy staring at the bench, at the man he had once called Mr. Reed. The sight of Judge Keaton seated there sent a jolt through him. For the first time, the full reality of what he'd done took shape, not as an abstract mistake or a bureaucratic oversight, but as a betrayal of the very foundation he'd sworn to uphold. His lies hadn't just broken laws, they had insulted the principle of justice itself. Keaton regarded him without emotion, his expression measured, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "Detective Mercer," he said, his tone neither cold nor kind, "you stand before this court not as an enforcer of the law, but as a man whose actions now require it." Cole's throat tightened. "Your Honor, I—" "Do not speak," Keaton interrupted softly, the authority in his voice commanding absolute obedience. "You will have your chance when the record demands it. For now, this court will review the evidence not in the shadow of assumption, but under the full light of truth." The hearing proceeded with precision. The prosecution laid out a meticulous chain of documents, altered reports, tampered logs, fabricated statements. Each one peeled away another layer of Mercer's deceit. With every exhibit entered into evidence, Cole felt the walls close tighter around him. His once eloquent mind scrambled for justification, but every defense collapsed under the weight of undeniable proof. And then came the moment that silenced even the most skeptical observers: the footage. A recovered security recording from the hospital corridor showed Mercer visiting Keaton's room the night before he filed his victim statement. The timestamp revealed what the written report had concealed. Keaton had still been unconscious. The video showed Mercer standing at the bedside, dictating into his recorder, his words clear and deliberate. He was constructing the story. Gasps rippled through the room. The defense attorney lowered his head, defeated. Cole's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of his own voice filled the courtroom, a ghostly echo of his arrogance replayed for the world to witness. Keaton didn't flinch. When the footage ended, he looked down at the papers before him, his tone calm, steady, deliberate. "In this court," he said, "truth is not a performance. It is the only authority that endures." Cole wanted to speak, to apologize, to defend himself, to reclaim even a shred of the control he'd lost, but the words refused to form. The silence that followed wasn't like the earlier courtroom stillness. This one was heavier, filled with consequence. The audience wasn't watching a trial anymore. They were watching a reckoning. The irony was devastating. The man who had treated the courtroom as his stage now sat powerless before the very law he had twisted. The same wood-paneled walls that had once amplified his voice now absorbed his downfall. When the session adjourned, Keaton didn't look at him again. He simply stood, removed his glasses, and left the bench. But for Cole, that image, the quiet dignity of the man he'd wronged, would haunt him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The world outside erupted once more in headlines. Federal judge presides over hearing of his own accuser. Mercer's lies exposed before the nation. Talk shows replayed the video endlessly, frame by frame, analyzing every flicker of Cole's expression. The man who had once written his own legend now watched it rewritten by truth. And somewhere deep inside, a realization began to take root that arrogance had been his downfall, but exposure was his sentence. The courtroom no longer belonged to him, nor did the narrative. He was no longer the storyteller. He was the story itself. The transformation was swift and merciless. Within weeks, Cole Mercer's life became unrecognizable. His badge was confiscated, his accounts frozen, his department-issued car towed from his driveway. His home, once filled with accolades and certificates of honor, became a hollow museum of a past self. The investigation deepened, unearthing patterns of misconduct that stretched years back. Cases built on shaky confessions, evidence that had gone missing, suspects coerced into silence. Each revelation carved deeper into his reputation, until nothing remained but a record of betrayal. His name, once synonymous with precision and excellence, was now shorthand for corruption. The trial that followed was not a spectacle of confidence, but a procession of accountability. Cole sat in the defendant's chair this time, flanked by lawyers who spoke more about damage control than defense. Gone were the flashbulbs of admiration. The cameras now recorded him with clinical detachment, their headlines stripped of glamour. Witnesses came forward, former colleagues, subordinates, even those he had once intimidated into compliance. They spoke not with vengeance, but with weary honesty. One officer described the culture of fear that Mercer had fostered, the pressure to close cases no matter the cost. Another recalled the way he manipulated evidence, his belief that truth was negotiable if it led to victory. Cole listened in silence, each testimony another brick sealing his fate. At times he tried to meet their eyes, but they looked past him, as though he were already gone. The sentencing was inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, the public demand for justice unrelenting. When the gavel fell for the final time, Cole Mercer was handed a prison term that would strip him not only of freedom but of identity. The man who had once wielded authority now found himself subject to it. Prison was not the cinematic punishment he'd imagined for others. It was slower, quieter, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of reflection. His cell was small, barely wide enough for the narrow bed and steel sink. The walls, dull and gray, bore no hint of admiration, no echo of applause. In those first weeks, Cole resisted introspection. He told himself the system had turned on him, that he was a scapegoat in a larger game. But as days turned into nights and silence replaced the rhythm of city life, his bravado began to erode. There were no admirers here, no juries to persuade, no stories to control. Only the sound of his own breathing, steady and shallow. He thought often of Judge Keaton, the calm in his voice, the unwavering conviction. He wondered how the man could show such composure, such restraint. That memory, once irritating, became a mirror he couldn't look away from. The other inmates knew who he was. Some mocked him, others ignored him entirely. The man who had once wielded fear now lived beneath it. Even the guards regarded him with a detached irony. Detective Mercer, they'd say, drawing out the title that no longer fit. A ghost of what he'd been. Each night, Cole lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks above him. He tried to remember when he'd started believing that power and justice were the same thing. Somewhere along the line, he'd stopped serving the law and started serving himself. That realization burned sharper than any sentence. Letters arrived occasionally, anonymous notes, some scathing, others sympathetic. One stood out, a simple envelope bearing no name, just a message written in an elegant hand. The law never fails. Only those who believe they are above it do. There was no signature, but Cole knew who had sent it. He folded the note carefully and tucked it beneath his mattress, the only remnant of the world he'd once ruled. And for the first time, the silence that surrounded him felt deserved. In the months that followed his imprisonment, Cole Mercer began to experience time differently. The hours didn't march, they lingered, stretching endlessly between the routine clang of metal doors and the soft shuffle of feet across the concrete floors. Each day began the same, the metallic creak of his cell door, the rationed breakfast, the muted conversations of men who had long ago made peace with confinement. For a man who once thrived on control, the sameness was unbearable at first, but slowly, in the absence of noise and power, reflection took root. It began with small realizations. The reports he'd once written with calculated precision now replayed in his mind like confessions. He remembered the faces of those he'd interrogated, some guilty, some terrified, most desperate. He'd told himself he was bringing justice, but now he saw how often it had been about convenience, reputation, and ego. He'd cut corners, pressured witnesses, rewritten truth because he thought the system's flaws gave him permission to manipulate it. Now, sitting behind bars, he realized that every decision had carved the path that led him here. His arrogance had been his armor, and for years it worked. It shielded him from scrutiny, insulated him from guilt. But the irony of arrogance is that it blinds before it protects. He could see that now. He remembered how he'd dismissed the quiet doubts that sometimes rose after a case closed too neatly. How he'd silenced the part of himself that whispered, "This isn't right." That silence was the beginning of his downfall. Some nights, when the prison was still and the distant hum of security lights filled the dark, he found himself thinking of Judge Keaton. He would replay the final hearing in his mind, the calm, unwavering voice that had cut through the noise, the deliberate way Keaton had spoken about truth, not as punishment, but as restoration. The judge had never raised his voice, never shown hatred. It was that composure that haunted Cole most. The judge hadn't destroyed him. He had simply held a mirror to everything Mercer had become. In the confined space of his cell, accountability stopped being a concept. It became something tangible, something he could feel pressing down on him with every breath. He realized accountability wasn't about guilt, it was about recognition. Recognition of the harm done, the trust betrayed, the faith shattered. It was about seeing the human cost behind every shortcut he'd taken. Cole began writing, at first just scattered thoughts on scrap paper, then full letters addressed to no one in particular. In them he recounted every lie, every manipulation, every compromise he had justified. The words didn't come easy. They scraped at his pride, exposing the rot beneath. But with each letter a strange clarity emerged. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could face it without the mask of justification. When prison officials discovered his writings, they transferred him to a program that allowed inmates to mentor younger offenders. It was ironic him, the man who had once believed himself above the law, now teaching others about the cost of breaking it. At first, the men he mentored didn't take him seriously. They mocked his past, calling him Detective Fallen. But over time, as he spoke not with authority but with humility, something shifted. He didn't preach about reform or redemption, he simply told them the truth. He told them how arrogance starts as confidence, how small compromises snowball into betrayal, and how the justice you twist eventually turns back on you. For the first time in years, his words carried weight again, not because of power, but because of honesty. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same voice that once manipulated juries now tried to guide lost men toward something better. It wasn't redemption. It was responsibility. Letters from the outside began to change in tone. Some came from victims of cases he'd mishandled, people who had once cursed his name, now writing with cautious acceptance. Others came from officers who had worked under him, admitting they too had been blinded by ambition. The acknowledgement didn't absolve him, but it reminded him that even broken truths can still teach. Cole stopped asking when he would be released. Time had ceased to matter. What mattered now was that, for the first time, he understood what it meant to serve justice, not as authority, but as humility. He had spent a lifetime demanding accountability from others. Now he was learning to live within its weight. And though his uniform was gone, though the world outside had moved on, something within him had begun to resemble the man he once pretended to be. It was nearly 3 years after his sentencing when the letter arrived. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakable, the ink bold against the ivory paper. The sender was Judge Jonathan Keaton. The letter was brief, devoid of sentiment, yet its words struck harder than any verdict. The law does not seek vengeance, detective, it seeks balance. In this courtroom, justice serves no master, not even the lawmen who think they own it. Cole read the line again and again, the words echoing louder each time. He could almost hear Keaton's voice, steady and deliberate, the same cadence that once commanded the courtroom. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a reminder. Justice was not a crown to wear, it was a burden to carry, and he had dropped it long ago. He folded the letter and placed it beside the old note he had kept hidden beneath his mattress. 2 fragments of the same truth, from the same man, delivered at different times but with the same weight. The rest of that night he sat motionless, staring at the faint lines of the prison wall, replaying the path that had brought him here. He thought of the courtroom silence that day, the look on the jurors' faces when the truth had emerged. He thought of the badge he had once polished daily, now lying in an evidence locker somewhere, stripped of meaning. Most of all, he thought of how he had mistaken fear for respect, obedience for justice, and applause for truth. When morning came, Cole requested permission to speak at a correctional seminar where former officers addressed recruits about ethics and integrity. His request was granted, with strict supervision. The day of the talk, he stood in front of a small group of new cadets, men and women young enough to still believe they were invincible. He didn't wear the orange jumpsuit with shame. He wore it like a warning. He began with no introductions, no dramatics, only quiet conviction. "I thought I owned the courtroom once," he said, "but the courtroom was never mine to own." His voice was low, roughened by time, but the sincerity in it was unshakable. He told them how pride can disguise itself as duty, how justice isn't a performance but a discipline. He spoke of the difference between serving the law and serving oneself, and how crossing that line can happen one small compromise at a time. As he spoke, the recruits listened in silence. Some took notes. Others simply watched him, studying the man who had once stood on the other side of power. When he finished, there was no applause, no gratitude, just quiet understanding. It was enough. That night, back in his cell, Cole sat on his narrow bed, the hum of the prison fading into stillness. He could almost see the courtroom again, the judge, the jury, the glint of the gavel catching light, and he could hear Keaton's words, final and absolute. Justice serves no master. For the first time in his life, Cole understood what those words truly meant. The screen fades to black for a heartbeat, then a slow pulse of ambient sound begins, a low thrum of tension giving way to a single spotlight illuminating the words. Justice has a voice, and every story deserves to be heard. The narrator's voice returns, calm, resonant, deliberate. What happens when power forgets its purpose, when truth takes the stand and refuses to be silenced? This was more than a story. It was a reminder. Justice doesn't belong to those who hold authority. It belongs to those who seek it. Soft cinematic strings rise underneath as the A1 Storyteller logo begins to fade into view. Subtle, glowing, authoritative. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, don't just leave with silence. Become part of the storytelling force that exposes the truth, one tale at a time. A gentle whoosh transitions to an unscreened prompt, followed by text that reads, "Join over 100,000 truth seekers who never miss an A1 revelation." The narrator's tone shifts slightly, inviting, charged with purpose. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you're first to uncover the next twist, the next truth, the next moment when power meets consequence. A brief montage flashes across the screen. Past titles from A1 Storyteller, shadowed figures, courtroom close-ups, newspaper clippings spinning into focus. Each visual syncs to a heartbeat like drumbeat, symbolizing tension and awakening. Then the music softens again. The voice lowers, intimate. Your comment could spark a discussion, your share could change a perspective, and your voice, yes, yours, keeps stories like this alive. Fade in text across a smoky backdrop. Engage, subscribe, speak truth. As the screen darkens to the faint echo of a gavel's strike, the voice delivers the closing line, quiet yet absolute. I'm the A1 Storyteller, and the next chapter begins when you press play. The final frame lingers. Years later, we shall dream of a clearer sky, accompanied by a brief sound cue, a deep cinematic humph signaling completion.